All right, a lot has happened over the past several days and weeks after the results of the three East German state election. In this video, I want to take a look at some of the news that's been coming out of Germany, some of the events that have been happening, and also take a look at the coalition talks in those three states to see where we are at forming a government. Now, the first major story that happened was shortly after the Brandenburg election, and that is Omid Nouripour and Ricarda, the co-chairs of the Green Party, resign. Now, these are the two leaders of the party itself. They are not the leaders of the party in the Bundestag or the leaders for or the candidate for the chancellor. They are the leaders of the party behind the scenes. So they deal with all the mechanics and organization of the party itself. And they have both been in the position since January of 2022. Ricarda Lang was considered to be, a young face of the party. She was only 28 when she became its chair. And after the Greens' bad result in the Brandenburg state election, following a string of poor results, they both decided their intention to step down, and they said that this is because they believe the party needs a new face going into next year's federal election. They are considered somewhat unpopular, and they need new leadership to kind of rebrand the party for the federal elections, which are planned for September of 2025. Now in Brandenburg, the Greens fell below 5%. This for an East German state is not unprecedented, but this is one of their best East German states. They got around 10% in the last elections, and so for them to get only 4% was a bad sign. And this doesn't mean they're going to fall below 5% on the federal level or in any of the Western states, but it is showing that the party is not only not where it was in 2021 or even in the polling before that, or at around 15 to 20%, but it's even further down in the polls. And this is a big deal because these were two very notable names within the party itself, and of course they are players in the German federal government, although they are not ministers. They are the leaders of the party that is the second largest party in the traffic light coalition. So this does have an impact, shows the instability and weakness of the German government. Now, another thing that happened was some of the leaders of the youth wing of the Greens, which is tied to the party, but of course somewhat standalone, resigned not only from their positions as the chair and co-chair of the youth Greens, but actually resigned from the party itself. And a lot of the younger people in the Greens are saying that the Greens and the SPD has taken more of a more right-wing position on migration, for example. They say that they are shifting their positions similar to the way the CDU is, and the CDU is going towards the AFD. They are blaming the parties for kind of moving their positions to the AFD while still attacking the AFD, but adopting some of their positions. Of course, the migration issue is a big problem, and the Greens, when they talk about elections and talk about in the open, they are still very against the AFD. They are still very supportive of loose migration or loose immigration controls. However, the party itself has somewhat kind of backtracked that position, and so there is a divide between there's been a divide in the Greens for a long time. There's two groups known as the pragmatist and the fundamentalist, and of course the fundamentalists are completely against any reform, any straying away from the old traditional green agenda, which is environment, easy access to migration, EU support for Ukraine, things like that. And so the youth, of course, which is more radical, is combating with the party itself, which has the responsibilities of being in the federal government. They have to make compromise with the FDP and the SPD. They have to make compromise with their coalition partners, and also they are not able to implement the kind of radical changes that the youth wants, and because of that, there is some rebellion within the youth of the party. So the Greens are in crisis right now. This does not mean the end of the party. This does not mean they're going to lose heavy support, but they are going through a rough time as a party right now. And there are going to be new elections for the leadership. There have been already some names that have said they're going to run for the candidacy of the Greens. However, they're not really notable people. Most of the notable people were these two, and of course, are already in the German cabinet. And there's not really it's not likely that the Robert Habeck, Annalena Baerbock, Cem Özdemir, any of the people that are in the ministries are going to also at the same time run the party. That's not always the case. That's not going to happen. It's possible for someone to be a minister or be a chancellor and also be the chair of the party, but that's not always the case. And I think right now it's unlikely. So we're going to have probably a change in leadership, and the new names, of course, will on one hand, they won't have the negative baggage that these two have, but they won't have the name recognition, the recognizability in public, so they will have to kind of present themselves over the next few weeks and months leading into the general elections next year. Now, if we take a look at the polls, we see the Greens are at 11%. This is not a bad result. I mean, for historically speaking, this is okay because the Greens were, much of the early 2000s, in the 90s, around 7-8%. So this is a okay result for them, but around 2019, 2018, they, surged to around 15, then 18, and even in May of 2021, I believe they reached a high of around 26%. So considering how strong they were over the past several years and what kind of potential they had as a party, this is definitely not where they want to be. They are in fourth place. This is a drop of around 4 points from the past federal election in 2021, which was already somewhat of a disappointment for them. So not a disastrous result for the Greens. They're not in the same position that the FDP is in, but this is not, I think, where the party wants to be. I think they see their potential being a lot higher. So that is, of course, the big issue for the Greens following the results in Brandenburg. Now, there was another issue, another event that happened in Thuringia, which had its election somewhat before Brandenburg, and similar to Saxony, and that was for the election of the Thuringian Parliament's president, or the speaker. Now, of course, the state of Thuringia has a governor. The governor of the state is elected by the legislature, and this is referred to as the minister president. Minister president, in German, you can translate it directly to prime minister, but I think a lot of people confuse that with the British prime minister. So I refer to them as governor. Now, of course, they are not the same as a U.S. governor. They are, of course, elected by the legislature and not directly by the people. Some of the powers are different, but I just kind of use that term interchangeably. But of course, the proper term is minister president, and that is the head of the state, the lead executive, the lead person that governs the state on a legislative level with laws, policies. But of course, there is also the Landtag's president, which is the president of the parliament itself, which is of course similar to a speaker in the House of Commons, U.S. representative, or a state legislature speaker. Now, it is customary that the largest party will put forward a candidate and they will be elected speaker. This is pretty much always the case. Even if the governor is from a different party, even if there's a coalition formed between two parties, if one of those two is not the largest party, it's likely that the largest party will be from the speaker rather will be from the largest party. So, for example, in 2014, when Bodo Ramelow first became governor, Die Linke was the second largest party. So, although Ramelow was the governor from Die Linke and the CDU was in the opposition, the CDU was still the largest party and had their candidate or their candidate for the speaker become the Landtag's president. Now, in Thuringia, what was very interesting was the AFD ended up winning first place, and almost all the other parties ruled out allowing the AFD to put forward the speaker. Now, the problem is that this is a very customary rule. This is always, this is somewhat that's unprecedented, because it has always been the case that the largest party puts forward someone that's a speaker, usually someone that's more professional, someone that is very familiar with the parliamentary way of life, parliamentary code, someone that's less of a firebrand in the party, someone who's more moderate, someone who's very respectable, has maybe a degree, or someone who's been in there for a long time, a kind of independent, nonpartisan figure that is very respected, that all the parties can support, and then of course that person has to get a majority approval and becomes the Landtag's president, the speaker. However, in this case, all parties refused to support anyone from the AFD for this position. So the AFD put up their candidate as Vivek Muskla as the largest party. However, the other parties refused to elect her, and there was an interesting situation in the Landtag because the first session, there's no president. And so the rule is, at least in Thuringia, is that the oldest member, meaning the by age, all the members in the Landtag, the one that is the oldest by age, will informally hold the first session as the speaker. Now, he doesn't have the full powers of the actual president, but he has somewhat of a customary role. And this time it was Jürgen Treudle from the AFD. So the AFD had somewhat of institutional power, although very fragile, being this kind of an informal position, and he carried out the first legislative session. Now, the other parties wanted to submit a proposal to basically allow other candidates, because initially the way it was that the AFD, being the largest party, would propose a candidate and the other parties would either accept or reject that candidate. But the other, the CDU, and the other parties were never going to support the AFD candidate, so they wanted to make changes and submit a proposal to allow another candidate, and the AFD gave somewhat of a resistance to that, and having Treudle in the position of the informal president blocked that for some time. So then the CDU ended up going to the court, the state kind of Supreme Court in Thuringia, and they ruled that the AFD rather, Treudle has to accept this proposal by the CDU. So he did, and what happened was in a kind of conventional race. So the AFD put forward their candidate, and she got 32 votes, the votes from all the AFD but no other parties, and then a man from the CDU, Koenig, was elected the Speaker of the Thuringian state legislature. So it was definitely a very spectacular event because this was unprecedented. There was a lot of clashes in the state legislature with the AFD, the oldest AFD member, the oldest Landtag member from the AFD, leading the first legislative period. There was a lot of clash between him and some of the leaders, the party whips of the CDU, because there was a struggle between the AFD being the largest parties and the group of parties that were weaker, separate, but stronger together, competing for, over rules and procedures to try and elect the speaker. Now, of course, in the end, the AFD candidate Vivka Mushla, seen here, lost. She only won the votes of the AFD, and the CDU candidate was elected to the speakership. Now, what is interesting is that the AFD did not win any of the vice speakers. There are three deputy speakers or vice presidents of the Landtag, and one was elected from Die Linke, one from the BSV, and one from the SPD, which means that the AFD, as the largest party, does not have the speaker or any of the three deputy speakers, and the other four parties all hold those positions. Now, the AFD actually has held vice presidents or deputy speakers before in Brandenburg, in Thuringia itself, and also in Saxony, where they have held one in the last legislative period and do now. Now, of course, there are different rules and in each of those states that make it easier or more difficult, and also the parties against the AFD might be more harsh in others than in some. So it's not unprecedented for the AFD to have a deputy speaker, but in this case, they ended up not having any at all, being the largest party. Now, this was going to be somewhat of a defeat for the AFD. They're not going to have the institutional power that they kind of wanted to have with this election result, but a lot is going to depend on how the voters see this. Now, if the voters see the AFD as being targeted, as being outsided, as being ostracized, maybe some voters will sympathize with the AFD, or the other way around, it could show that the AFD is kind of not legitimate because no other parties will work with them, and the only alternatives that can get things done are the parties that are in this kind of new that formed a blockade against the AFD. So this could end up hurting or helping the AFD, but then again, unless there's a snap election, it's going to be 5 years until the next Thuringian state election. So I'm not sure how much of a result this, an effect this will have on the result in 5 years' time. So that is the situation in Thuringia. And what I last want to come to is, of course, the coalition talks in the three states. Now, it's looking increasingly likely that the BSV is going to be a part of all three state coalitions. They are key players in the coalition talks in all three states. Now, in Saxony itself, the CDU, BSV, and the SPD are holding coalition talks. It is almost certain that this coalition will be formed and Kretschmer will become the governor. I mean, Kretschmer has almost a 100% chance of becoming the governor. And if we take a look at Saxony, we see the CDU, the SPD, and the BSV have together a majority. The former government of CDU, Greens, and SPD lost their majority, and this is the most likely. Now, there is a problem with the BSV and the CDU working together. There are some people in the CDU who are against this. There is some resistance from the CDU in West Germany, or also in some of the CDU in Eastern Germany, against working with the BSV. And it's very interesting because the CDU has a non-cooperation agreement with Die Linke, but largely due to Sarah Wagenknecht being in Die Linke, because the idea was the CDU did not want to work with Die Linke because it's too left-wing, it's too far left, it's too radical, and it also has the connection to the East German Communist Party, which was a kind of, the CDU was the most pro-American, pro-NATO, pro-West German party, very hostile to the Soviet Union to the East. And so for them working together, it's very it's not logical for them to be working together. Now, some argue that the BSV is not the same as Die Linke. It's not the same party. It doesn't have the same infrastructure. So in a way, there is no need for a non-cooperation agreement between the CDU and the BSV. However, a lot of the problems between the CDU and Die Linke were because of people like Wagenknecht. Wagenknecht, when she was very young, gave statements kind of defending some of the actions of the Soviet government. She also, was openly, many of her supporters were openly, identifying themselves as communists, where some of the more moderate people like Ramelow would identify with the Social Democrats or, Democratic Socialists. And so there is a kind of two-way, there is a divide within German society, within the CDU itself, over whether or not Die Linke or the BSV is more extreme than the other, and that debate is going to kind of play a big role into this, and we will see what happens. Now, of course, the BSV on the federal level is arguing that there needs to be no American military missiles, rockets, bases in Germany, and that is a position that is completely contrary towards the CDU, and that is also, it's a position that the CDU and the BSV are miles away from each other on. Almost all the foreign policy issues, the BSV and the CDU are the complete polar opposites. The CDU is probably one of the most pro-Ukrainian and pro-Israel parties, whereas the BSV is probably the party that is most friendly towards Russia and Palestine. the BSV is probably the most anti-NATO, somewhat critical of the EU, probably not as much as the AFD, and then the CDU is one of the most pro-EU, pro-NATO parties. So foreign policy, there's a lot of issues. Now, fortunately for them, the statewide politics is very different because, of course, a lot of these foreign policy issues aren't going to matter on the state level. However, that might cause a problem. You might see pressure from the fact that those issues are still going to exist between the two parties, and so that could be an issue. But as of now, I think that the only thing that's allowing this to happen is how fragmented these states are. These are not normal times. In a normal scenario, this coalition would not happen. But the CDU has said they don't want to work with the AFD, and the only reason they're okay with working with the BSV is because they are prioritizing ruling out working with the AFD than ruling out working with the BSV. But this is still going to be a somewhat, we'll have to see. If the BSV holds true to some of their positions, this might be a very unstable, very, a coalition that's going to force the CDU to either compromise a lot, or it's going to be a very fragmented and divided coalition. We could even see snap elections in a few years in some of these states. I think in Saxony, it's very unlikely. I think Kretschmer will lead a government that is somewhat stable, but there will probably be some internal divides here and there over the next several years. Now, in Thuringia, we have a similar situation between the alliance. Now, the CDU, SPD, and the BSV do not have a majority. They are currently in coalition talks. Now, there's two options. You could either replace the SPD with Die Linke, which is going to be problematic because then there's no argument whether or not the BSV or Die Linke is more compatible with the CDU because all three of them will be together. And then the BSV and Die Linke themselves have kind of a personal bad blood between them because they were once part of the same party, and even if they share some of the issues, even if they still might agree on many issues, there is still the anger and frustration that they split apart because if they, arguably if they had remained together, Ramelow would still be governor, they would still be maybe the second largest or the largest party in Thuringia, and so Die Linke is going to have a kind of personal anger towards the BSV. So this might not be a very stable or friendly or healthy coalition. So if this is not practical, we could see the CDU, SPD, and BSV tolerated by Die Linke. Now this might be more of a stable government internally, but they don't have a majority, and they're going to rely on elements of Die Linke for tolerance in terms of passing laws. So this is going to be very unstable either way they go. I would say as of now, I think that a CDU, SPD, BSV minority government tolerated by a few from Die Linke, notably Ramelow himself, is probably what's going to happen, and we will see in the days to come. Now, or the weeks to come rather. Now in Brandenburg has had its election, 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later rather, so the coalition talks are not as developed. But as of now, it's actually a lot more simple because when you look at it mathematically, the SPD and the CDU, which is the most likely government, is also the incumbent government, which when you include the Greens, doesn't have a majority. They have half the seats. They are 1 seat short. No one's going to work with the AFD, so there is no, not including them as of now because everyone has ruled out working with the AFD. So the other option is SPD and BSV, which has a majority. So as of now, if the SPD does not want to work with the AFD, which is, going to stay, that means the only government with a majority is SPD and BSV. Now, you could say it's possible, I guess, for the SPD and the CDU to form a government and the BSV to be, a minority government and the BSV to be supporting them. But I have a feeling since the SPD and the BSV are both technically left-wing parties that this is going to be slightly more stable than the BSV SPD is going to be slightly more stable than BSV CDU. So I think here a majority government is actually somewhat likely. And the leader of the BSV in this state is actually from the SPD. So even though there's going to be some disagreement on some issues, such as foreign policy and also the response to COVID, those are the two notable differences that caused him to leave the SPD. On a lot of issues, maybe housing, education, all of the very, basic statewide political issues, I think they're probably going to agree on a lot. And so I think in the end, Dietmar Woidke will be reelected governor in a coalition between the SPD and the BSV. So that is going to be it for this video. I wanted to give an update on the East German states. And of course, we have the federal election next year, but it's going to be a long time until that. The next election that's going to happen in Germany before that will be the state election in Hamburg, but we still have several months. That should be around February or March of 2025. So we still have around 6 months for that. There's not really any new polling, so I won't cover that yet, but those are the elections that will happen next in Germany. And of course, there's 2 more state elections in Austria itself, so I'll be covering that over the next few days. But I want to give everyone an update of the situation, the way German politics has kind of reacted to these state elections. And of course, once we have the finalized, new governments or any more developments or updates, I will do some videos on those. So If you do like these videos, please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you all for watching.